Hey guys, we're doing the appendicular skeleton. That means the appendages, which are things that are hanging off of the trunk or the axial skeleton. So what you have are the arms and legs, basically. There's four areas that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to do this video and a little bit differently. I'm going to break it up into different pieces and be part 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we're going to talk about the pectoral girdles first, and that's four areas: pectoral girdles, the upper limbs, the pelvic girdle, and the lower limbs. So pectoral girdles attaches the upper limbs to the axial skeleton. The upper limbs are the arm, forearm, and hand. And the pelvic girdle attaches the lower limbs to the axial skeleton. Lower limbs are the thigh, lower leg, and foot. So there's 206 bones in the adult skeleton. You learned the ones, the 80 that are in the axial skeleton. Now we're going to work on the 126 that are in the appendicular skeleton. Luckily, a lot of those bones are in the hand and feet, and they've got basically the same name. They're just numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So it's really not nearly as hard as it sounds. But there's 64 bones in the pectoral girdles and upper limbs, and there's 62 bones in the pelvic girdle and lower limbs, because there's 27 in each hand, and there's 26 in each foot. So that gives you 2 less on the lower limbs than you had in the upper limbs. Next slide. So if you remember your bone markings, we talked about the appendicular skeleton. The foramen, fossa, crest, condyle, epicondyle, head of a bone, be the end of the bone, line, trochanter, tubercle, and tuberosity. So we're going to talk about some of these bone markings as we're talking about or a lot of these bone markings as we're talking about the appendicular skeleton. Next slide. So what is the pectoral girdle? Pectoral girdle is the scapula and clavicle, so your collarbone and your shoulder blade. And so you've got the clavicle on the anterior side and the scapula on the posterior side. And you'll notice that the clavicle, remember we talked about the axial skeleton, the clavicle articulates with the manubrium of the sternum, and then it articulates with the scapula. The scapula articulates with the humerus, which is the upper bone in the arm. So really the only place the pectoral girdle touches the axial skeleton is at the manubrium, is at the sternum. The rest of it hangs off with ligaments, various places. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So pectoral girdle, it's going up around the upper, where the upper limbs hang off of your body. Next slide. Here's a little bit better view of the pectoral girdle, anterior view, and then you have the clavicle and the scapula. Next slide. Posterior view showing the scapula. Next slide. Here's a close-up view of the clavicle, showing the inferior side of the clavicle. So you have what's called the acromial end and the sternal end. Sternal end, you can probably guess, refers to where it attaches to the sternum, and then the acromial end is where it attaches to the shoulder blade of the scapula. Scapula has a projection off of it called the acromion. So that's where the acromial end of the clavicle is going to touch the scapula. Next slide. So here's where the acromial end goes. You'll notice that the clavicle is this S-shaped bone. It's got a curvature to it, like this. So this always tells you that the one curve is always pointing anterior, the other curve is always going posterior. So the sternal end is a flat end, so that's flat. And the acromial end it's flat, it's vertically. And the acromial end is flat horizontally. And you'll be able to see that in a side view here in a second. So how do you figure out which end is which? Well, the flat vertical end is going to hit your sternum, so your manubrium of your sternum will be on the sternal end, and the acromial end touches right up there, touches the acromion of the scapula. Next slide. Scapula. So now here we see what the acromion is. So we're going to start on the right side over here. So we have the acromion is here. We have the body of the scapula. We have the spine of the scapula going up here, and the spine of the scapula then ends in the acromion. And then we have a border up here. This is called the superior border up here. This is the medial border, and this is the inferior angle, and this is the lateral border. So that tells you that this is a right scapula looking at, so this is looking at you from the back. If you look up here, that gives you your perspective on things. So you're looking at it from the back, so spine of the scapula. If you reach back behind your back, you can actually feel that spine of the scapula sticking up there on both sides. And you can follow it actually up onto your shoulder, and that's the acromion that is sitting up there. And then you can follow it and follow over and just feel the collarbone attaching to the acromion and feel that going all the way across to your sternum. So you can feel all the way from the spine, across the acromion, across the clavicle to the sternum. And you can feel that entire pectoral, top part of the pectoral girdle there. So the superior border, the medial border, since this is the right, so that medial border is going to be closer to the vertebral column. And then you have inferior angle and then the lateral border. These fossa that are in here, so they have the supraspinous fossa and the infraspinous fossa. So these two fossa are where certain muscles attach for what's called the rotator cuff, and we'll get into that later on when we talk about joints. So here's, then go on the far left side of this scapula picture, and we look at, so we have the body of the scapula here. So this is the, so this again is the lateral border, inferior angle, medial border here, sorry, and superior angle and superior border here. And then there's it's also called suprascapular notch. You can see that on both sides over there. So here's a suprascapular notch. So here's your acromion coming off the spine of the scapula, ending in the acromion. Then there's another projection here. This is called the coracoid process. Coracoid referring to a raven's beak is what that looked like to someone. Then we have, so this is the lateral, it's called the lateral angle is here, the lateral border, inferior angle. So we have this in the body of the sternum in here, and this is a depression, so this is called the subscapular fossa. So there's also another muscles that attach here, and then we're going to look at the lateral view. So that was the anterior view. So let's if you're looking straight at your face, this is what you're going to see looking through your body. You would see the body of the scapula here. Now let's look at the lateral view over here in the middle. You have the acromion popping up top, and then you have the coracoid process sticking off there. Then you have this, in blue, you have this thing called the glenoid cavity. Glenoid referring probably to like mirror-like. It's unclear where the word came from, but it's covered with the blue. The blue is supposed to be hyaline cartilage because this is an articular surface. It articulates with the head of the humerus. So that's the ball and socket joint of the shoulder. And you have four muscles that hold that ball and socket together, and those four muscles are the supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, the subscapularis over here, and I was looking for the other one. Where's the other fossa? Yeah, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, subscapularis, and oh, that's right, it's not a fossa. There's another one called teres minor. Sorry, I was blanking for a second, for a minute. Teres minor, it's another muscle that comes off of the bottom down here. It's actually a smaller muscle that comes off of here, about here. So those four muscles form what's called the rotator cuff, and those attach to the scapula, and then they attach to the upper part of the humerus. So next slide. So here's another figure of the scapula showing. This is just showing the acromion coracoid process, glenoid cavity, and the spinal scapula, and all the same things that we saw before. So next slide. Here's another view of the actual bone, showing the glenoid cavity coracoid process, acromion. So the acromion, remember, is where the clavicle attaches to the shoulder blade. Next slide. And a posterior view of the scapula, showing the spine very clearly. Here is the spine. My label didn't come through. So this is the medial side, here's the lateral side. So your glenoid cavity obviously is always going to be on the lateral side because that's your arm is, your humerus is hanging off of the glenoid cavity there. Next slide. So here's the relationship of the humerus and the thoracic cage and the pectoral girdle of which is formed from the clavicle and the scapula. So this here you have the clavicle. Sorry, you have the clavicle here, and then you have the scapula, and since that's the acromion there, then this is the acromioclavicular joint, is that right there. So that's where the acromion and the clavicle come together, the acromioclavicular joint. Then where you have the clavicle, fill that in again, clavicle and the sternum, the clavicle and sternum come together here is called the sternoclavicular joint. So the sternum and the clavicle. I guess you can also call it the manubrial clavicular joint if you wanted to call it that too. So here's the manubrium, and then this is the humerus, the arm. The arm is here. So upper arm bone. Next slide. So here's the right pectoral girdle and humerus. This is anterior view on the left and a posterior view on the right. So you have your you have the scapula, easily seen, and the I'll outline it there, and the clavicle coming across there, and then you have your humerus. So the head of the humerus fits into the glenoid cavity there, and then we'll talk about the other parts of the humerus here in a second. But this upper part. You have two tubercles where muscles attach. There's a greater and lesser tubercle. There's also a groove. It's called the intertubercular sulcus. A sulcus is a groove. So, and there's a tendon that goes up over that and underneath the acromion and attaches up here. And so there's a that attachment is important. Sometimes there's a bursa that gets inflamed. It's right above that. There's a bursa between this bone right here and that tendon. Sometimes that gets inflamed, causes some pain in the shoulder. So this is a posterior view. You see the spine and scapula here, the acromion and the clavicle coming off there. So the greater tubercle of the humerus is there. You also have so you have the head of the it's the head of the humerus, and then you have, which is actually underneath there, and then you have what's called the anatomical neck, which is where this dotted line is here, and then you have what's called the surgical neck, which is here. Anatomical neck is the actual anatomical region that's defined as the neck. There's a head and a neck on the long bones. The surgical neck is where the bone often breaks, and so you have to have surgery at that spot, rather than the anatomical neck is not usually where the surgery has to occur. It's usually, this is a thinner part and it has a lot more stress there, so that's where you have a lot of breakage happen there. Then you also have other parts to the humerus of this long bone of the upper arm. You have what's called the deltoid tuberosity, and then you have the body of the humerus is the shaft, and then you have some other parts we'll get into when we look directly at the humerus. We're going to talk about the bottom end of the bone down here. So I'll save that for the next video.